What up, Pittsburgh Steelers fans? It's Matty P here with another episode of Steelers War Room. This episode, we're focusing on the wide receivers for the Pittsburgh Steelers: Diontae Johnson, George Pickens, Allen Robinson, and Pat Freiermuth. But before I get into today's show, just want to give you a reminder, you can find us on Steelers TDU on Apple, Anchor, and Spotify for the audio side as well. We're primarily doing most things through YouTube, particularly because we're doing some of the shorter content, like, clips under sort of 10, 15 minutes. We don't put all of those out on the audio side, but we definitely do all the live shows that Mark and I do each week, plus as much as we can elsewhere with some of these 10, 15-minute videos. But some of them don't make sense because they use a lot of the visual medium as well. We've had a lot of new subs in the last sort of week or so, certainly since the draft. Welcome to all those new subs. Hope you're enjoying the content. If you are really liking it, obviously you can hit the like button on a particular video and you can hit the bell icon to get the notifications and subscribe, but also tell a friend. They might be interested in it too. We'll try to offer a really diverse set of shows and topics and focuses from a Steeler fan perspective. Now, the War Room series, for those of you, the War Room series, this is about putting you in the minds of Omar Khan, Mike Tomlin, Rooney II, Andy Weidel, and all the rest of the Steelers front office as they look to put together a winning roster. And this year, it's 2023 and beyond. And a roster, as I've always liked to say since this show began as a podcast back with the Steel Curtain Network, a roster that will compete for a 7th Lombardi trophy. And, certainly there's been improvements through the offseason and now through the NFL draft in the last 2 weeks that are definitely getting Steel fans hyped for what 2023 could bring, and particularly about going deep into the playoffs, as Omar Khan has said in his roundups. So before I get fully into it, wanted to share the rationale why we're doing this show. So this show is actually more focused on Allen Robinson and looking at the role of Allen Robinson within the Steelers wide receiving core this year. Why am I doing this? Because amongst Steeler Nation, even Ryan Shazier, when he went on the Football and podcast with Ben Roethlisberger, talked about the fact that Allen Robinson was going to make a great slot receiver. A lot of the narrative I hear out there in Steeler Nation, social media, commentators, is that Allen Robinson is going to be the slot receiver for the Pittsburgh Steelers. I think that's a little bit premature. And about almost 2 weeks ago now, there's been a lot of other content we've had to focus on. I actually went and dived into some stats, and I found some pretty interesting comparisons. Now, I'm not saying he's not going to be the slot receiver for the Pittsburgh Steelers. You have to remember the role of Pat Freiermuth and, a guy like Anthony Miller in the depth chart. I don't know Anthony Miller's and Allen Robinson. But the stats tell a bit of a different story. The other thing that I found really, really interesting too was that this week, Omar Khan's been doing the rounds, and I was on the Pat McAfee show. I listened to the 21-minute or so interview he did with Mike Florio on Pro Football Talk. And in that, he clearly said Allen Robinson offers us abilities in the slot and outside. I think he actually said outside first. So I just thought, you know what? I'm hearing this narrative. Everyone's just penciling him in the slot. I get that he could do some awesome things in the slot. I mean, Shazier's no liar. If he had not had the awful injury, he'd be a Hall of Fame middle linebacker. But I do think it's premature. And I also don't know if it serves the team in the best interest. But rather than just what I've got to say versus what people that have played in the NFL and an NFL GM's got to say, I mean, other NFL commentators, because I've heard him being used in the slot. Pac-Man Jones was talking about that. Pat McAfee hate Pac-Man Jones, but that's what he was talking about as well, and he has played in the NFL. I thought, let's actually have a look at the stats and let's see where it makes sense for the Pittsburgh Steelers and where doesn't it make sense. So I put together some stats. Now, I've had to use PFF. I know not everyone loves PFF. PFF is one of the only sites that will actually break down where a receiver actually lines up in. Same thing on the defense in terms of which position they're lining up in, depending on where they are lined up against the tackles in line and etc. The other thing I think is really cool from the outset that I want to say is that apart from the offensive line, Diontae Johnson and George Pickens were the the players with the most amount of snaps last year on the offense. So Diontae Johnson had 89.83% of the offensive snaps in the games he was able to play. And Pickens had 76.03%. Pretty high for a rookie, but clear number 2 wide receiver on the roster last year. So they're definitely getting a lot higher volume of snaps, and how that works out with Allen Robinson is going to be really interesting. I kind of feel like you've got almost a 1B, and before we get into the stats, like I sort of feel like we've got a 1B in Deontay. I don't think he's a 1A in the NFL, as controversial as that's going to be to some people. I don't. George Pickens is a 2A. Allen Robinson's probably a 2A, 2B as well. 2A if fit, and he can regain some of that talent he showed early on, and probably a 2B, worst case, I think. Right? So that's pretty cool when you've got Austin and Miller and Boykin there as well. Now, so let's get into Robinson first. Robinson, as you can see, 6,946 yards in his career, 44 TDs, 12.8 yards per reception, has a 60.6% reception percentage on the target. So he's had 897 targets, so call it 900 targets thrown his way. He's caught almost 550 balls, right? So pretty experienced guy. I don't care about PFF grades, I don't go into that. But what you'll see on this list that I've got in front of you is his slot snaps. Now, I've actually sorted this by yardage, and interestingly, touchdowns is pretty similar. Slot. His best season in his whole career in 2015, he only played 15.1% of the snaps in the slot. His second best season, 1,300 yards, 6 TDs. That wasn't his second best from a TD perspective, but second from a yards perspective. 29.4%. So not even 1 in 3 snaps, right? Less than 30%, less than 1/3 of the snaps played in the slot. Now, that was a year of 108 receptions too. So that was his biggest amount for receptions. He also had 98 receptions in 2019. That's a season where he played 41% in the slot. So 2 in 5 snaps were in the slot. And he had 1,147 yards, 7 TDs, his second best TD year. So again, not saying he can't play in the slot, but just saying maybe we're penciling him in there as just this slot role, and that's not what he's going to do. What I've also found interesting was that if you actually look at the yardage, he's had 4,136 yards in seasons where he played less than 30% in the slot. That's kind of an interesting thing too. He's now, unfortunately, what I'm not able to dive into with the stats that I know that are available to me. If someone knows another website where you can pull this, then great. Is how many touchdowns were in the slot, how many yards were in the slot as well. I don't think we get that breakdown, which is unfortunate. I would have really liked that. But yeah, almost 2/3 of his TDs were in non-slot majority seasons, or in the non-slot seasons above the 30%. Now, you can see some of his poorer seasons in the league. Basically, 33.6 yards in 2022 with the Los Angeles Rams. 33.6 yards, 33.6% of the snaps in the slot there, 36% for Chicago in 2021. And obviously this has got to come down to the games that he played, and you can see the targets there as well. When he had 144 targets in 2016, he played about 21.5% in the slot. So he's definitely playing in the slot each year. It's just you can't walk away with the narrative saying Allen Robinson is a slot receiver. He's not. Yes, he can play there, and yes, he could be very valuable here and there, and yes, it means you're not asking him to do a heck ton, which is good for a player coming off a major injury, and maybe this is the way he works himself back. But then you've got to think about what's the overflow effect on the other Steelers main receivers or receiving targets. So let's have a look at Deontay Johnson. So Deontay Johnson, 558 targets over the course of his career, 356 receptions, 63.8%, so he's higher than Allen Robinson. 3,797 yards, average of 10.7, 21 TDs, so he's at about less than half of what Allen Robinson's TDs are, but he's played Allen Robinson's over 10 years in the league. Deontay Johnson's only played in 4. And so when you look at his overall slot percentage, he averages 11.3 11.3% of his snaps are in the slot. He had a season high, almost a career high with 13.1% in 2022. He had 13.4% back in 2020. Now that was interesting as well because Ben was back. And again, TDs, he had none last year, so that's kind of interesting. But in the year where he also played the most amount of his slot, percentage at 34%, he had 7 TDs. He had 9 TDs in 2021. So you can't glean that Deontay Johnson's a slot receiver. I don't think anyone's remotely ever suggested he's a slot receiver. He's an outside guy. He's a possession catcher. So I don't think you're going to see Allen Robinson, for all his production, swap out for Deontay Johnson in terms of outside. Deontay's sticking outside. That's going to be the case. Which probably raises the question, what about George Pickens then? Right. So with George Pickens, and I've got him up as well, he's only played one season. So it's very difficult for us. I don't want to overemphasize what he is going to do and what he's not going to do. 52 receptions from 84 targets, 61.9% catch percentage, but on the targets. But remember, he also had a really good contested catch rate percentage. I think it was averaging out, I think it was like 72%, which is ridiculous for a rookie wide receiver. Now, he averaged 15.4 yards per reception. That stuck with back when we were still Curtain Network when he got drafted. I said, this guy is going to be able to deliver on 13, 14 plus, a game or yards per reception. He had that in college. I think he averaged, over 14.6 off the top of my head in college. So pretty crazy. He had 4 TDs. So you'd love to have seen him. I'd love to see him this year get 1,000 yards, 6 TDs, 7 TDs. That'd be a win. Remember, he had 4 TDs. This team only threw for 12 passing TDs. So not too bad from that perspective. Now, interestingly, he only played 13.1% of the snaps in the slot. So when you think about that, and you think about Allen Robinson, and you think about Deontay Johnson, there's probably a lot of you listening saying, well, hang on, you started the show saying Allen Robinson is not going to be a slot receiver. He probably is based on this. The interesting thing in 2022 was we had Chase Claypool, who was taking a lot of snaps in the slot because he can't hype on a ball. He can't run routes. He's not a good player in the NFL. He probably should have been brought in as a tight end, a flex tight end like a Kyle Pitts. That didn't happen. That was a mistake. Steelers did make a mistake there because they didn't need that. They didn't play that sort of offense. They shouldn't have drafted him. But we turned it into Joey Porter Jr., so everyone's cheering. Everyone loves it. All good in the hood, right? From that perspective. But, when it comes to understanding what this means for the offense, you then have to turn to who else did they use in the slot. Now, the only main guy we're probably really that factors into this equation of where does Allen Robinson line up is Pat Freiermuth. So Pat Freiermuth, 2 seasons in the league, he's lined up in the slot 36.4%, so over a third of the snaps in 2022 and 32.3% in 2021. So that's 34.4% of his receiving snaps have been in the slot. That's only 1/3. You kind of think it would be higher. Now, again, Pat's missed time for concussions. Pat's also, as you can see, mainly played in line. He's an inline tight end. He's not a slot receiving. He's not that flex guy in terms of like a Kyle Pitts. But wide I found was interesting at like 5 or 6%. Also, there's plays where he will actually block on what's considered a passing down. So that's another interesting question to the mix. So when we think about who is going to be the slot receiver, if you're asking me, yes, I do think Allen Robinson will take a number of snaps in the slot, as will Pat Freiermuth. They'll want to diversify that up. But what I do think is more likely is that you have situations where, and this is going to be interesting if we go back to Deontay Johnson too, because we all know his drop history. He had 8 in 2022, 8 in 2021, 15 in 2020, right? He's had 34 drops in his career. He's quite a bit higher than other guys. George Pickens only has 4 in 1 year. Pat Freiermuth only had 6, and he's going up there and getting contested catches too, particularly his rookie year. Allen Robinson, I didn't get his drop rate, unfortunately, because I cropped it too early, but I can pull that up while we're talking. But the reality of the matter is that Deontay Johnson's drop rate means that he needs to perform in this season, particularly his pay grade. So how does this affect the slot? What I think they'll do is they're going to have sets where it's George Pickens, Deontay Johnson, obviously, as the 2 wide receivers on the field. You have someone in the slot, whether it's Allen Robinson or Pat Freiermuth. You may not have Allen Robinson on the field for that. But what they've got is a guy that can play outside and in the slot. And when I talked about the needs a couple of months ago when we kicked off the channel for what the Steelers needed, I was talking with Marky D on one of our shows, and I said they need a guy, they need a 2B wide receiver. They need someone if one of these guys goes down. They're way too thin. They've got that guy in Allen Robinson. The other thing I think would be cool is to see a bit more from Pickens in the slot, right? Have Allen Robinson go outside and stretch in the field. Have Pickens inside, where if you can get him into space and get him free with his footwork, his tenacity. I'm not saying I want to see Pickens play 40% of his snaps in the slot, but move him around, get him more involved. And that's a narrative that you've heard throughout this offseason when people comment about the Steelers and young Kenny Pickett and George Pickens, is how they get Pickens more involved. We heard about training camp, like the training exercises that Kenny organized. Even Trubisky was there with the guys in Miami, and you're trying to use him more around the field. So when we think about what is Allen Robinson and his role, we also can think about what are the opportunities for George Pickens does this create for him to get the ball? How does it lessen the burden that Pat Freiermuth carries? And that's what I love about the acquisition of Allen Robinson. There's a video when we signed him. You can go back and listen to that. We did a breaking news video on that. It did get a lot of views. It was one of our highest rating videos before the draft. Really enjoyed putting that together. That was a lot. That was a quick reaction to that. Basically, as soon as I woke up, great pickup there. But I really wanted to cover off how is the slot changing for the Steelers in terms of the slot wide receivers, and also Pat Freiermuth. What is his impact on him, and how the Steelers going to use Allen Robinson? Obviously, we've got to wait for training camp. We've got to wait for the preseason to see how this goes. But I love the acquisition, as I said, of Allen Robinson for the simple reasons of A, we fill that slot need, ease the burden on Pat Freiermuth. B, we get to be versatile now with George Pickens. He's not just stuck on the outside. He can go hunting for the football. They can go get him that football. And you've got a guy that if Deontay Johnson, George Pickens goes down, he steps into the role. And if not, he can just come back to being a really productive wide receiver in this league. Maybe he gets it, and maybe he has an 800-yard season, and Matt Canada's offense is firing in the slot. Maybe he gets a lot of TDs in the slot. But that's a really exciting thing that I'm keen to see when it comes to Allen Robinson on this Pittsburgh Steelers offense in 2023. So as always, that's going to wrap up the show. As I said, throw out the comments. Give me your thoughts on what you think about Allen Robinson. Mark and I we should be streaming live for the schedule release on Thursday evening your time. So we'll try and do that pretty quickly. We'll go through that as soon as it's released. Give our takes on what this means. We'd already done our record predictions a couple of weeks ago. You can go check that out. And so it'll be interesting to see where that ladders up or how that might have changed for us both based on which games occur in what weeks. But with that, that's going to wrap up this show. As always, go Steelers.